Greetings from Stanford University. I'm Bill Barnett, professor at the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability and the Stanford Graduate School of Business.
And I'm Charlotte Kramer, a current undergraduate here at Stanford.
And we have today Professor Buzz Thompson from the Stanford School of Law and the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability, and Professor Paul Milgrom from the Stanford Department of Economics. And gentlemen, you just put on a conference on advancing sustainable water management. Huge issue in sustainability and the world. And Charlotte, you were at the conference. How do you feel about what you heard there?
Yeah, going into the conference, I really didn't know what to expect that much. I knew water management was a huge issue, of course, but I didn't realize how we treat it so much as an economic issue. And it makes sense to me in hindsight because, I mean, water, it's a commodity, but it felt more like a human right going into this conference. And then I looked at the actual workings of, how do we manage water? And it's not a human right. It's like an economic market. And I think that was really interesting for me because I just didn't understand that at first. And then throughout the conference, we talked a lot about pursuing equity as well. There was a whole session on pursuing equity. And it made me think again, well, there's not going to be equity if all that we're doing is changing supply and demand and using market forces. Subsidies are good for low-income people, but if you're retracting subsidies, so anyway, the question of equity and economics, I think that's what I thought most of during the conference.
Well, yeah, I think making this distinction about it's either a human right or it's a commodity maybe oversimplifies the situation rather than saying one or the other. There are elements of we care about the economic aspects of this because we need water to be used efficiently, and we want to encourage innovations that are that let us use water more efficiently, and we want to where the supplies are limited, we want them to move to the more valuable use. But that doesn't take away all the non-economic effects that we still care about. We do care about preserving communities, supplying water as a human right. That continues to be true. Part of the question is how we balance these things and get the benefits of economic efficiency.
I agree entirely with Paul. Water is both a commodity and a human right. In fact, one of the things I frequently say is that water is a public commodity. Water is essential for life. And one of the things that we have to make sure is that everyone have an adequate amount of water in order to survive, in order to maintain human dignity. But once we've satisfied that particular right, then after that, water really is a commodity. The question is which farms are going to end up with the water? To what degree are we going to have water used in our cities versus our agricultural areas? And markets can do an amazingly effective job of that. There's also another potential conflict, though, that we didn't talk about as much at the conference, which is with the environment. So the environment is another public good that we have to make sure that we're supplying with society. Interestingly, environmental water is something that markets are now providing. So that there are a number of organizations like the Nature Conservancy that historically acquired land in order to set it aside for conservation. They're now going on to the water market and buying water that they then put back into rivers and streams to protect the fish.
That's interesting. Charlotte, I've known you now for about a year since you took my course, and you've always had a tendency to think in terms of the importance of solving a lot of the problems that get brought to the surface when we talk sustainability. I'm going to give you a chance to give your professors a grade. So what grade does Paul Milgrom and Buzz Thompson get? What grade are you going to give them with respect to their ability to bring to the table some solutions to these fundamental problems?
I'd say Paul. I'll give you an 8. I like the inclusion of innovation. I think, and that's another thing that we talked about at the conference, this idea of how can we innovate in the water management system. And I think that's interesting to me because I always saw it as just, something that the government does. I think even Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations wrote that, the government, they take care of water and hospitals and stuff. So private innovation, I think it's interesting, especially in developing markets.
Okay, so you gave the Nobel laureate an A. All right, that's fine. And what about Buzz?
A-, I'd say. I don't think there's enough look into the future. I think you're a little too, it's a human right and it's a commodity, but, so what? Like, there's so many people that aren't getting this human right. Like, what's the answer? I think there needs to be more enforcement. I think personally there needs to be a further drawback away from the economics of it all at more sort of local scales.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that. I am never going to forget the day that Charlotte gave Buzz Thompson an A-. So, Buzz, what do you have to say to Charlotte?
Well, I'll say 2 things. The first is you need to read my new book because I have a book out called Liquid Asset, which specifically talks about the innovation in the private sector and how we actually need that in order to solve problems.
I should have read it.
But
Paul beat you to the comment, I think.
Okay. But I think the reason why you may have given me an A- is that I talked during my presentation about the fact that we really are neglecting the human right to water in the United States. California is the only state that recognizes the human right to water, and it's unenforceable in California. And so what I was really focusing on in my presentation was, what does it mean to have an unenforceable human right? And the answer is that actually valuable to have recognized that water is a human right, because it means that the advocates for safe, affordable, accessible drinking water can now go to the legislature and demand action. We haven't seen that action yet, but we're on our way.
That's a great response. So, what I'd like to do is go around the table. We'll start with Charlotte, go to Paul, and then to Buzz, and have each of you maybe talk about one finding that came out of the conference that you found to be especially interesting. And please, with each of you, try to translate that finding so that regular folks like me can understand what it is that the researcher had discovered. So, Charlotte, do you mind if I put you on the spot and have you go first?
Yeah, I think, again, just to reference the promoting innovation talk, I really liked Megan's mention of CapEx and OpEx when innovating water management systems, and how the private sector really comes into play during times of high stress on water management. So because they only see this every once in a while, wishy-washy use, it doesn't really matter what kind of operating expenditures they have, rather what kind of capital expenditures and barriers to entry they have to even just getting water in the first place.
Interesting. And that's Megan Mauder, who's a professor at the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability, yes, if folks want to look into that research more. Okay, well, thanks, Charlotte. Paul, what came out of the conference that you found notable?
Well, I found quite a few things notable in this conference. Some of them had to do with solutions. The proposal for in the future, as global warming reduces the storage we have in the snowpack, the possibility of recharging aquifers by having 2,000 10-foot deep 5-acre pools. It was explained to us, and how that affect the water quality in the aquifer, that it could be done in a way that preserved. It sounded like a solution. So that was one of the things that I thought was was a really interesting contribution that I'd like to think more about.
Oh, that's great. Now, and who was the scholar there, so our folks can?
It was Scott Fendorf who
right, of
did
course.
the presentation.
Yeah, that's right.
And one of the things that we know we need to do in order to be able to get through droughts is to be able to store more water, because we have sometimes when we have excess water and we need to be able to store it for those periods of time when we know we're going to be short. And we could build new reservoirs, but those are amazingly expensive, very difficult to build. And so what Scott was talking about was this idea of actually storing the water underground in the aquifers, which nature provides us for free. Scott is a soil scientist. And so what Scott was doing was saying, hey, this is a great idea, but we need to be very careful about exactly where we are trying to store that water. Because if we're not, then we could leach uranium or various other hazardous substances into that groundwater, which we're using for drinking water purposes. And the good part of the story was he said there's plenty of opportunity to store water and not worry about the chemical constituents.
Wow, that's one of the great things about this conference is that you two, coming from very different disciplines, obviously, law as an expert on water, Buzz, economics, an expert on markets, Paul, were willing to come together and bring your colleagues together. So we have soil scientists in the same room as we have social scientists. That's pretty incredible, and we appreciate that. And now let me come to you, Buzz, for your takeaway.
So I would say that one of the things that I was most impressed by were all of the economic presentations, because there are real opportunities now to use markets to do everything from dealing with the Colorado River, where we not only are short of water, but we have a structural deficit. We know we have to reduce the amount of water being utilized. To one of the presentations was on wetlands in Florida and the need to try to preserve as many wetlands as possible. And there again, we can use markets through wetlands banks.
So one question that I have, because you especially mentioning such a sort of technical innovation, I think coming into this conference, I came from a place of, to solve these kinds of issues, we're digging wells. That's what we're doing. That's how we're getting more water. But it seems like the social sciences really do have a big role to play in just getting water to the right places. Would you say that sort of the fundamental issue of water management and attaining the human right to water, is that an issue of a market or a technological sort of delay? Or
it's more than just getting water to the right places. We've been overusing water. We've been overdrafting our aquifers. We have a structural deficit on the Colorado River. We're using millions of acre feet more than can be sustained. We have to have reductions taking place, and we have to find new forms of storage because we have fluctuations in the amount of water that's available from year to year. And so what we're talking about is doing a number of things, about using water well. That is not just trying to drill deeper and deeper as our aquifers get used up, but to recharge the aquifers, to eliminate the lowest value uses, to promote innovation so that the same results can be gotten with less water. We need to do all of those things. Water is fundamental to life, and we use huge amounts of it, and it's hugely overused, and all of those issues need to be addressed.
On that note, someone mentioned, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but someone mentioned the issue of population, and this is something that I keep coming back to, especially as a young person, thinking, oh my gosh, do I want to add to this population? It's such a big issue. And Steve Gorelick, he stated even that population change, according to his models of Indian freshwater evaluation, a change in population would be even worse than, droughts caused by climate change and that kind of stuff. Just the sheer amount of people. Is there any role that we as people concerned about water need to play in not population management, but discussing questions around population.
We almost always seem to ignore the population issue when we talk about water, even though it is at the root of all of our water problems, and probably the root of most sustainability issues. I'm not concerned about population increases generally around the world, because there are a variety of ways in which we can continue to grow in places, for example, like Southern California, and still meet our water needs. We can always turn, for example, to greater amount of recycled water. In California, we only recycle about 10% of our water. And we can always turn to desalination. We're in a place like California not running out of water. We're just running out of cheap water. We just have to find more and more expensive ways of producing water. The problem, though, is that areas around the world where we see the fastest population growth are frequently areas where we already have the greatest water scarcity. That's true in many areas of the Middle East. It's also true in Southern Asia. And that we need to do something about, because those regions are too poor frequently to rely upon the type of technological options that we may be able to utilize. And yet they're already water scarce, and it's just getting worse.
So, Paul Milgrom, Nobel laureate. Once a person wins the Nobel Prize in economics, presumably he could study anything he or she wants, right? I mean, you could study anything, and yet you have chosen to study water. Why is that?
Well, a couple of reasons. Two big ones, really. One is it's a big, important problem that I've become connected to through people at Stanford. And second, because I have hopes that I actually have something that I might be able to contribute in this way. The need to revise property rights, to create the foundations, to create a market so that we can solve some of the problems associated with water, the ones that markets address, as I've described. That's the kind of thing that I've done before, and it seemed to me to be the kind of thing that I might be able to do again, and that was very attractive.
Well, that's and I wish you all the luck in that. Now, Buzz Thompson, you've been studying water much of your career, since I've known you for decades. You are, and as you look forward to the future, where do you see the greatest upside for good news and innovation and change regarding water?
Yeah, so I see it coming primarily in the technology field. We have immense new opportunities to increase the amount of water supply, and at the same time also conserve our water through new technologies. And the problem is that the market right now does not provide the type of support for the development and commercialization of that technology as it does, for example, in the energy field. If we can just pay as much attention to water as we do to energy, we're going to see immense opportunities.
Okay, well, I certainly hope we do that. And so to wrap it up, Charlotte, let's give you the last word. Coming away from this conference, hearing all about water from all these perspectives, what would you like to leave us with?
I guess a thank you on behalf of my generation for sort of thinking about these issues. I remember when I was a kid, I never even, thought of issues surrounding water. And then last summer, the little village where I'm from in Luxembourg was hit with a flood so bad that we didn't have water for a week. And it's experiences like that that make you think about water and how important it is. And it was a really amazing conference to attend. And I'm so thankful that you could appear on our podcast.
Oh, thank you very much, Charlotte. And Paul Milgrom, Buzz Thompson, thanks to you both. And to you listeners, until next time. The Stanford Initiative on Business and Environmental Sustainability podcast series is sponsored by the Stanford Graduate School of Business and the Stanford Dorr School of Sustainability. Music by Charged Particles. That's Caleb Hutzler, Mike Rock, and John Krosnick.